This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled Science and Technology Since 1914. The purpose of this video is to cover, at least in some broad strokes, some of the major changes in science and technology since 1914. And obviously science and technology has greatly changed our world and continues to do so. So this video will really just hit some of the major highlights. Science and technology have greatly influenced human life and has spread through what we call the human web. Now, one of the major changes in science and technology since 1914 is in physics, and it deals with atomic technology. Now, in the decades prior to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, French scientist Marie Curie and her husband Pierre Curie had worked on radioactivity. Marie Curie particularly isolated the elements of polonium and radium, and these were major advances in atomic theory and radioactivity. In fact, Marie Curie won 2 Nobel Prizes for her work in science, and she was actually the first woman to win a Nobel Prize beginning in 1903. Another major figure in physics in the 20th century is Albert Einstein, who built on the work of earlier scientists such as Marie Curie, as well as the work of German physicist Max Planck, who had particularly been involved in quantum physics. In 1905, Albert Einstein put forward his theory of relativity, and this is the idea that space and time vary according to the observer. For Einstein and his theory of relativity, the only constant in the universe is the speed of light. Einstein further proposed that mass and energy were related, expressed in the formula E equals mc squared, or energy equals mass times the square of the speed of light. Now, Einstein's theory of relativity caused a great deal of debate in the discipline of physics, but ultimately it was accepted. And the theory of relativity overturned the older idea of Isaac Newton that the universe operated like a machine. Einstein's universe was more fluid, with the only constant the speed of light. Now, Einstein's approach to this on a more theoretical basis would lead to huge changes in science, totally changing how physicists saw the universe. And in the 1920s, with the theory of relativity accepted, other scientists such as Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr worked on quantum mechanics and atomic theory that would later have a big impact during the Second World War. During the Second World War, with all the advances that had occurred in physics and in atomic theory, the United States government created a massive program to build a new weapon called the atomic bomb. And this new weapon would be built in a massive project called the Manhattan Project. Now, the Manhattan Project was a top secret government program. It was massive. It employed over 130,000 people. It cost $2 billion. There were facilities all over the United States that worked on this, with the largest in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico. Now, while there were many, many people involved in this, the most prominent scientist associated with the Manhattan Project was American scientist Robert Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer was a physicist and the director of the Manhattan Project. However, it is worth pointing out that several European scientists, many of whom had fled Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, advised or assisted Oppenheimer with his work on the Manhattan Project. And this includes men such as Albert Einstein, Hans Bethe, and Enrico Fermi, just to name a few. Ultimately, the Manhattan Project was successful. It produced the first atomic bomb in the world, with the United States using 2 atomic bombs against Japan at the very end of the Second World War. The use of the atomic bomb was a new development in the military, but it was not contained within the United States. During the Second World War, Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, had placed spies within the United States. And he knew about the Manhattan Project and about its course of development. In fact, Soviet spies stole the secrets for the atomic bomb that the Americans had developed in the Manhattan Project. And after the Second World War, Stalin had his own atomic bomb made. Famously, Stalin had his secret police build the atomic bomb and threaten his scientists either with death or with building the bomb. In addition, Stalin used political prisoners to dig out all the uranium necessary to build the atomic bomb, and these political prisoners were exposed to terrible conditions and often died of radiation poisoning in the aftermath. But by 1949, the Soviet Union had its own atomic bomb. During the 1950s and 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union built up enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons, consisting of thousands of bombs and missiles, enough to destroy the world several times over. And the fear of a nuclear war became a major component of the Cold War, particularly during the 1950s and 1960s. Also, after 1949, several other countries decided to build their own atomic bombs. And this included Great Britain, France, Israel, China, India, and Pakistan. And the idea was that building atomic weapons would guarantee their own national security. The issue of nuclear proliferation, more and more countries obtaining nuclear weapons, has become a major concern in the world in more recent decades. Now, atomic technology has also been used peacefully, not simply to build atomic bombs, but also to build atomic power plants to produce clean electricity in many nations. A good example of this is in France, where most of the electricity in France actually comes from nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants are much cleaner than oil. They do not produce carbon emissions, and in that sense they are much more environmentally friendly. The downside, of course, is that accidents from nuclear power plants, if and when they occur, can be catastrophic because of the radioactive fallout. Fortunately, there have been very few accidents at nuclear power plants since the Second World War. But there have been two that are worthy of mentioning. The first was the Chernobyl accident in 1986, at that time the Soviet Union, in what today is the Ukraine. The Chernobyl accident was largely a result of poor safety procedures in the Soviet Union, and is considered part of really the end of the Soviet Union as a nation. The conditions have become very bad all over the country, and ultimately you had a meltdown of a nuclear reactor, again at Chernobyl in 1986. It spewed radiation over much of Europe. It was considered a huge embarrassment for the Soviet Union. The second major nuclear power plant reaction in the world was the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan in 2011. And this was a horrific accident, but it occurred largely through coincidences of natural disasters. Namely, Japan experienced a tsunami and an earthquake at the same time. And those two happening at the same time overwhelmed the Fukushima facility, and the nuclear power plant melted down. Now, for better or for worse, nuclear weapons and nuclear power have become important to the modern world. Now, while atomic technology comes out of the discipline of physics, there have been several major changes also in biology as well. In the 1920s and 1930s, in biology, the most popular idea, what was all the rage in biology, was an idea known as eugenics. And eugenics is the idea that heredity determines much about human life. Those who supported this idea wanted to encourage those they considered with good genes to breed and have more children, while those with bad genes were supposed to be discouraged from having children. Those with bad genes were considered those who led to more criminals in society, or those with mental problems, or who were asocial, or misfits, and so forth. Now, eugenics was very controversial, but it was very influential as well. In the 1920s and 1930s, some governments used the idea of eugenics to implement forced sterilization programs. And this includes a number of states in the United States, the largest of which was California. Eugenics played into the fears of population decline in some Western European nations after the First World War. It also played into a number of the racist ideas that were very common in the day as well, as eugenics had very strong racist connotations. Usually those who subscribed to eugenics believed that those who were not white were racially inferior and should be discouraged from having children because of the idea of eugenics. Now, as such, eugenics had a deep influence on Nazi ideology. It had scientific pretensions and had a deep influence again on Nazi ideology. The Nazis considered what they were doing is fully scientific. And this includes Nazi policies, most horrifically, the Holocaust itself. Now in biology, eugenics fell out of favor after the Second World War because of the Holocaust and because of its association with Nazism. However, there were major breakthroughs in biology after 1945 that totally changed the trajectory of biology. The first, and arguably most important, was in 1953 when American biologist James Watson and British biologist Francis Crick together discovered the structure of DNA. And DNA was not known beforehand. And this greatly changed how biologists understood hereditary and in part helped move them away from this notion of eugenics. The discovery of DNA had a tremendous impact on our understanding of a number of things in biology. Things as diverse as agriculture and plant biology, evolution, individual biological identity, race, medicine and disease, and even criminal investigation, just to name a few. Without knowledge of DNA, there would be no CSI. Knowledge of DNA has even changed the discipline of history. A prime example of this in American history was that America's third president, Thomas Jefferson, it has been concluded through DNA evidence that he fathered a child with one of his slaves. And this was unproven before the existence of DNA. From 1990 into 2001, an additional international research project called the Human Genome Project was also underwent, and it mapped out human DNA, or the human genome as it was called. And the Human Genome Project has greatly improved our understanding of DNA in general. Now, another major advancement in science and technology has been in space technology. Advances in space technology especially took place during the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to use space exploration during the Cold War to improve their image in the world as the leading nation in terms of science and technology. Exploring space was new in the 1950s and 60s. It carried certain prestige with it across the world, showcasing advances in science and technology. Now, the Soviets got an early jump in all this in 1957 with the launch of what was called Sputnik. Sputnik was the very first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. And when the Soviets did this in 1957, it created a worldwide sensation, and it made it appear that they were ahead of the United States in technology in general. The Sputnik launch was a great embarrassment to the United States. Under President John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s, as a reaction to the Sputnik launch, the United States put a great deal of resources into science education and to space research. Now, this culminated in 1969 with the Apollo 11 mission, which put the first human beings on the moon, again in 1969. And this occurred when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans as part of the Apollo 11 project to walk on the moon. Now, the moon landing was a huge PR and scientific accomplishment for the United States. It tended to show that America had leaped ahead of the Soviets, despite the Sputnik launch. The space race was very fascinating for many people across the world in the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. In fact, many children in the 1950s and 60s grew up with a desire to become astronauts because it was such a cultural phenomenon as well. Now, since the 1970s, and especially since the end of the Cold War, there's been a fair amount of international cooperation in the space race. The end of the Cold War in 1991 made exploring space less of a Cold War sort of contest. But still, having a space project, a space program, is a mark of national pride. As China has become a rising economic and political power since the 1980s, the Chinese have come to have their own space program, again as a mark of national prestige. Now, one of the most practical things to come out of space technology has been the launching of satellites, both by governments and by corporations. Satellites have been used for everything from observation and communication. They have become key for our knowledge of the weather and weather predictions, They're also used by governments in spying operations, and they're used in scientific experiments. The final major advancement in science and technology since 1914 had been in the area of computers. Now, the television predates computers. It was first sold to the public in the 1950s and became very popular in many first world nations in the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond. And the television greatly influenced everything from politics to pop culture to sports. Computers also came about in the 1950s and 60s. Computers had been used during the Second World War. In the 1950s and 60s became more commonplace. As the name suggests, the name computer, computers were first machines that were used to make mathematical computations. But the first computers were huge devices, enormous devices. They were made up of vacuum tubes and electronic circuits, and they were so large they took up entire rooms. Because of their sheer size, during the 1950s and 1960s, it was impractical for people to have computers in their homes or their businesses. So in this time period, computers could only be found at large institutions, such as government institutions, large corporations, or research universities. But a major change in computers occurred during the 1970s. In 1971, the microprocessor, or commonly known as the microchip, was developed. And this was a crucial development, as for the first time it allowed computers to become much smaller. One can fit a lot of information on a microchip, and that was not possible before its invention. Because microchips allow for computers to shrink, a prototype of the personal computer, or the PC, was first developed in 1975. The PC, or personal computer, would really take off during the 1980s and 1990s. It was smaller, more compact, you could fit it on a desk, and thus it became popular in businesses and in homes, used for all kinds of information technology and computing. Personal computers made processing data and sending out information much easier, making business operations much more efficient. Of course, computers were also used for entertainment, particularly for video games. Now, the speed of change with computers was and still is today breathtaking. Beginning in the 1980s, each new computer that came out featured more powerful microchips that were smaller and had more and more memory and computing power. In the 1990s and 2000s, microchips even became small enough to place in cell phones, which then became commonplace. And the name of the game has still to this day been shrinking the microchip further and giving it more memory and more power. And this continues to happen with each new technology in computers and cell phones that come out. Now, microchips are so powerful today that your cell phone has more computing power than the spaceship of the Apollo 11 landing in 1969. Now, changes in the world of computers since the 1980s has had a dramatic impact on the economy, and information technology has become more and more important. It has led to the rise of new powerful companies such as Microsoft, whose founder Bill Gates has become a billionaire and one of the most wealthiest men in the world. Also, very importantly, in 1990, the Internet, which was first developed as a means of communication for the military, was made available for commercial and civilian use. And since 1990, when the Internet was made available to civilians, the Internet has radically changed how people all over the world do business, shop, and even conduct their personal lives. Likewise, the Internet has led to the creation of many big new corporations that did not exist and had no impact on our life beforehand. This includes companies such as Amazon, whose founder Jeff Bezos is now the wealthiest man in the world, companies such as Google, YouTube, as well as social media sites such as Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. Now, none of these companies existed or even could have existed prior to the rise of personal computers in the 1980s and the rise of the Internet following that in the 1990s. However, it is worth pointing out the Internet has caused problems in some industries. It has led to layoffs in the field of journalism as fewer and fewer people purchase newspapers and simply get their news online for free. Now, while the Internet offers a wide variety of conveniences to law-abiding citizens, It is worth noting as well, it has also been used by criminals, from everything from fraud to human trafficking. Likewise, terrorist groups such as ISIS have been skillful in using the internet to spread propaganda and to recruit new members. Some observers have also remarked that the internet and social media actually makes people lonelier and contributes to social and political polarization that many nations are now experiencing. As with any technology, the internet and computers certainly have their downsides. So let's make a few concluding points here. Science and technological advances have greatly changed the world since 1914, in everything from nuclear technology to advances in biology and medicine, to space programs to computers. And we've only scratched the surface of some of these main developments here in this video. Many of these things have greatly improved human life and contributed to our understanding of the world and to ourselves even. However, they have downsides, from the potential of nuclear war to destroy the entire world and that could end all life on Earth, to some of the problems that the internet has caused. So science and technology certainly have their positive sides, but we must remember that they still involve human beings and they have not changed human nature. As such, they are not cure-alls for the human condition. Humans have long struggled with how to properly use science and technology, and may well continue to struggle so in the future as well. We'll have to see. I'll stop with that observation. Thanks for watching.